have no idea if I'm live. Am I live? This is the mystery. There it goes. Well, it says I'm live. So here we go. I attempted to do a normal video, but my software kept crashing because I believe I went over length. I was supposed to do a 25 to 30 minute video. It came out as a 50-minute video and then kept crashing. So I'm redoing it. So this is an office hours presentation where we answer questions, formulate and explore arguments, give philosophical perspectives, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. This is from the Caffeine Philosophy website, for those of you who don't know. I received the following email. Chris, the hero and the man gave me chills and made my eyes well up. I've read the Odyssey 5 or 6 times, each in a different English translation. Never been an Iliad fan. Read it just once, the Fitzgerald translation. But because of your book, I've just ordered Fagel's Iliad. Looking forward to reading with new eyes. It's fantastic. Excellent. During your Republic exploration with Donovan, Jack seemed to dismiss Emily Wilson's translation. My 2 favorite Odyssey translations are Fagel's and Wilson. You didn't comment on Donovan's Emily dismissal, so I assume you're in agreement with him. Yes, I am. Here's my question. What are the criticisms to Wilson's work? Bryce. And this, he had some additional positive things to say about Letter to Anwei, which is very, very kind. I love this question. I love nerding out on language. I think it's far more important than most people give it credit for. Just a window into this kind of thing. You can look at the importance of language in news coverage, how certain news stories are covered. The subtle differences in language of how something is phrased and framed make a tremendous difference in how it is received by the audience. And I think we see the importance of that kind of dynamic at the roots of our culture when we look at ancient texts that form the background, the backbone, I should say, of our kind of moral ideals and our aesthetic ideals. So if you're a Christian, that would be the Bible. How is the Bible translated? If you're not Christian, it might be something like Homer, which is the case for me. So the problem with translations, and I think it's worth going over this a little bit before we get into Wilson in particular. Translation is not a science, at least not of poetry. If you're translating like a scientific paper or like a history text, you basically have one job. How do I translate the semantic meaning from source A, from source language A, I should say, into source language B? And that's it's not terribly hard as far as translation goes. But it gets a lot harder when you're not translating like a scientific paper and you're translating instead, say, a novel, where the author is not just conveying meaning, but tone and feeling. There's a wonderful writer, a Latin American writer named Borges. If you haven't read his short stories, you owe it to yourself too. It's unbelievable, mind-bending experience. But he was once being interviewed about his love for the English language. And he says the English language is so rich and potent because it draws from all these different sources. And he described the lightness of the Latin word spirit. It has this light and airy sound to it. The spirit of Frank. It brings to mind a light, perhaps even angelic, pleasant, benevolent feeling to it. And he said, contrast that with the very dark Anglo-Saxon word, ghost. Now, ghost and spirit are semantic equivalents. They're synonyms. But they are not interchangeable in the world of fiction, and especially not in the world of poetry, because of the quality and the feeling and tone that they convey. And so much of what we experience in poetry, which introduces a third challenge to the translator, not only do you have to get the semantic meaning, not only do you have to get the right feeling and quality and tone, you also have to get the rhythm and meter correctly. And when we're talking about Homer, most translators don't even try with the rhythm and meter. Will just try to catch the meaning and the tone, and the general feeling of the work. So, it might be impossible to do a truly great translation of a poem from one language to another, but you can do at least a decent translation, and I mean that in the moral sense of the term, a decent translation of the poem, if you are doing your best and attempting to grasp what the artist is trying to convey and bringing that to the reader, or just writing it down for yourself, perhaps, to the best of your ability, trying to feel where the artist is coming from and convey the feeling and the meaning and the rhythm and meter, as best you can. So, you can fail in a number of different ways. You can translate words badly. You can omit words. You could alter phrases, which is not quite the same as translating it badly. You can add phrases. Sometimes some translators believe that necessary. We'll go to an example of that in a minute. You can break the rhythm or meter of the lines. Most translators of Homer do that because they feel like they can't, actually go all the way with that. Greek and English are different languages. You can't do dactylic hexameter very easily in English. I only know of one poem that does it. It's the Charge of the Light Brigade. I'm sure there's more, but the worst failure, I think, is you can just fail to convey the feeling of the poem. And I want to give some examples of translations of the Iliad to begin with. The Iliad begins, Meinin aedetheia peleiadio Achilleos, olumenein, hemudi akaiois alge eteke. This is the first two lines, which, and I'm going to read a few translations of this, and I'll go back through and explain kind of what's going on here. So one of my personal favorites, by no means the best in any kind of academic sense, it's just one copy that I had that meant a lot to me at the time, is the Lang translation. It reads, Sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles, Peleus' son, the ruinous wrath that brought on the Achaeans woes innumerable. Okay? So it's worth pointing out, and we're going to see this in a lot of different translations, that Lang altered the word order. And the word order matters a lot. There's a wonderful book by Greg Nosh that I keep recommending to everyone called The Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours. It is not a 24-hour read. But there's a passage in that book where he describes the importance of word order, and Bryce here mentions he's read The Hero and the Man, so he already knows all this. I'm just explaining it for other readers. The opening lines serve in the way that copywriting headlines serve. The subject matter. In a news story, you'll have the headline, which gives the entirety of the story in a couple words. Then there's a subheading, a subtitle that will give you a little bit more detail. And then the first paragraph of the article will actually give you another summary in paragraph length detail. And only by about the second paragraph does it begin with a chronological account of what happened. And that is exactly how epic poems work, at least in the Homeric rhapsodic mode. So what we have in Greek, meinin aedetheia, it's the literal translation is wrath. There's a big asterisk there because menis is a lot more than just wrath, but you translate as best you can. Meinin aedetheia. Menis is wrath, aede is sing, and thea is goddess. Peleiadio is son of Peleus, and Achilleos is an alternative spelling for Achilles to make him fit into the meter. So, sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles, Peleus' son. So they changed a few things, but it conveyed the meaning well. Oulomenein, which Naj translates as disastrous. Lang translates as ruinous. That's pretty good. I won't go into more details with Lang because I already did a 50-minute one that didn't work. So we'll try to be more concise here. Let's talk about the Butler translation. Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans. So Butler also did sing first. And this makes a kind of grammatical sense in English. Because if you start with wrath, as Fagles does, we'll get to him in a minute, you have to do weird things. You have to like throw hyphens in to begin a new clause. Kudos to him for trying to do it. So, but you're risking de facto making the act of singing or speaking, conveying this poem, the primary subject of the poem, and that's not what's in the Greek. But anyways, that's where Butler's at. Sing, O goddess, the anger of Achilles, son of Peleus, that brought countless ills upon the Achaeans. Countless ills, the Greek is myri, which is the root that we have for the English word myriad. So if I were to ever do an Iliad translation, I would try to use the word myriad because I like that etymological connection. He doesn't include Oulomenein at all there. So there's an omission. He has his reasons for doing that, I'm sure. So you can nitpick any of these translations if you like. Again, with the sing, O goddess. Let's move on to Latimore. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles. Here we have Peleus before Achilles, which is the proper order. But anger is the third word, as it is with Butler. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles, and its devastation, which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans. So Oulomenein is translated as devastation. Cool. That seems to match. And the pains thousandfold, thousandfold for Marie is, it works, but you're beginning to see here the subjectivity inherent in the act of translating poetry. Here's Fagles, one of my favorites. I like Latimore, but Fagles is truly excellent. Rage. Goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses. Now, Fagles does a number of interesting things here. So first of all, he adds a hyphen, so a one-word clause before the first line, just so that he can keep the first word consistent with the Greek. I admire that a lot. Causes him to have to repeat the word rage, which maybe adds some emphasis. Maybe that's not the worst thing with poetry. Murderous, doomed. So he actually uses two words to translate Oulomenein instead of just one. So, obviously that's not a one-to-one literal translation. So you could dock him points on precision in his translation if you wanted to, but the cost of that would be maybe Oulomenein is too complex and weighty of a word in Greek to find an appropriate English translation. We're going to run into that in Polytropon in a little bit. Now I'm going to read my all-time least favorite translator. Nothing personal, just the translation. And that is not Emily Wilson, but Alexander Pope. Pope's translation of the first two lines of the Iliad reads as follows. Achilles' wrath to Greece the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. Everything is messed up about that. We're so far beyond, word order. Achilles' wrath is not the first line. Wrath is the first word, but we put Achilles in front of it. We completely added the word spring just so that we would have something to rhyme with sing, which he put as the last line of this clause instead of the second. So, but more than just the word order or anything, the entire tone of it is this sing-songy, courtly, elevated, like European aristocratic kind of poetry, and that's not what Homer was doing at all. There's another wonderful book I will recommend, that is Why Homer Matters by Adam Nicholson, and he gives a fairly lengthy drumming down of the Pope translation. I can't recommend him highly enough. He is the best introduction to Homer by far that I know of. But so we've beaten on Pope and his completely euphemistic, courtly language. So how does Wilson translate the first few lines of the Iliad? Because she also did the Iliad. She says, "Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, which caused the Greeks immeasurable pain and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades." Now, in my crossing over here, I accidentally included part of line 3, so we're going a little farther than the first two. But notice that first line. She doesn't begin with rage, as Lattimore and kind of Pope attempted to do, nor does she begin with sing, which would be the kind of more native English, grammatically appropriate and sensical kind of opening line. She begins with goddess. Now, she's not the only translator to do that. There have been a couple others. One of them said goddess. Another one said muse. I don't remember their names offhand, but it is the least common opening word, and I think for good reason. And if I don't think the rule of good copywriting, where you begin with the subject descriptors in the first line in order, is purely prescriptive. I think it's also descriptive. I think it describes what the writer is prioritizing, not just saying what they should put first. Especially given how incredibly good of a writer Emily Wilson is. She's a phenomenal writer. She's very, very good. I will come down in a little bit and read the full intro to her Odyssey shortly. She's a very good writer, not the sort of one who would bury a lead by mistake, So I think leading it with goddess in the context of the Iliad is a signal of sorts of her intention. And that may, if you are a careful listener of this, your skeptical flag should be going, Chris, you're kind of reading into this a lot. Yeah, we'll get more into it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hop over here. Let me make sure I have audio output capture. I do. I'm going to play a little bit of Emily Wilson for you so you can hear her. And hopefully this won't go on too long, but I'm going to start that now.
But the poem is also showing how exclusive that code is. It only applies to elite men. When women try to travel, as in the case of Helen, it doesn't go so well. And also the poem is showing us how easily Xenia can go wrong. So the suitors act like bad guests, invading Odysseus' home without asking. And Odysseus responds by not a very nice host, killing the guests. The original poem to me is compelling because of the nuance with which, and the complicatedness of its presentation, of its own core values and ideals. So before I get just to this is the beginning of my translation, I just want to give you one example of complicatedness. I use the word slave for words that I've been shocked to realize how common this is, commonly rendered with servants or maids or housekeepers in other English translations, even those that came out after mine. I think that decision to make the characters who are explicitly slaves in the original into housekeepers in translation is motivated by this desire to idealize the society of Homer and simplify its ethical and social world. So I wanted to bring out the ethical and literary complexity more clearly than I felt other translators had necessarily done. I'm going to read my beginning. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. So I think you can see that that's a passage about leadership, responsibility, and it's about these multiple different sides that there are to Odysseus.
All right, so I picked the wrong spot, not the spot I had intended to, but it's such a good point. I'll pick up here anyways. This was a lot smoother when I had it all pre-recorded. She just said this is a passage about responsibility and about leadership. And there's a line in here where she says, he failed, and for their own mistakes they died. Now, later on in this talk, which I have linked in the description for anyone who's listening, I encourage you to go and listen to as much of it as you can endure. She explains her sort of reasoning and methodology behind why she made certain kinds of translation choices. And a lot of her points were fairly severe and pointed criticisms of previous translators, Fagles in particular, for adding words that she thought, as she just described, were not in the text. And she was just talking about slave. Later on, she will talk about the word slut and how that was interpolated into the text, but it's not there in the Greek, which is true. We might imagine that they thought, based on the context and the tone of the characters, it was an English word that matched the meaning conveyed in the Greek, perhaps. But what we see in her opening lines here is she says, he failed, and for their own mistakes they died. That two-word clause, he failed, is not in the Greek. What is in the Greek it is translated by Greg Naj in the following way. And this is lines, I want to say 5 and 6 here. Naj translates, but do what he might, he could not save his comrades, even though he very much wanted to, for they perished through their own deeds of sheer recklessness. And then the next line says, disconnected as they were because of what they did to the cattle of the sun god Helios. Now, what you have there is basically 3 lines that all agree with each other and repeat with profound emphasis the responsibility for the fate of the comrades on themselves. They brought it on themselves. There was nothing Odysseus could do. They were disconnected. The Greek word for disconnected is actually, I love Naj's translation, disconnected, but it's not an intuitive one. The word nepioi, which is used, can be translated also as like children or like blind fools. So their own foolishness. This is a triply emphasized point about that Odysseus's shipmates bringing their own destruction upon themselves. And she says this is really about responsibility, and Odysseus failed. He failed. No, he didn't. There's no Greek phrase like he failed in there. There is a Greek word that means like to draw into oneself, to kind of save. And the word uk is, or I'm sorry, not uk, oud, O-U-D, is used to say this did not happen. He was not able to save them. There's no positive word for failed in that way. She added that to the Greek text. Now, why do you think she did that? When she is so critical of other translators adding things in book 22, and she's adding things in not just book 1, but the very opening lines, the theme-setting lines of book 1, to put responsibility and blameworthiness upon Odysseus where it did not exist in the Greek. It was, in fact, contradicted by the Greek. This theme of responsibility is not just a big point where Wilson in particular is concerned, and this is a big sticking point in her lecture as it pertains to the serving girls, who she calls slaves, and because they can be called slaves in the Greek, they therefore have no agency, so they weren't responsible for whatever happened with the suitors prior to Odysseus's return. never mind Eumaeus, who is also a slave in the same Greek sense, and who is morally commendable and praiseworthy for his loyalty and devotion and so forth. So, anyways, it's an obnoxious theme that we see in the mouth of none other than Zeus. It's one of the first lines of dialogue we have in the Odyssey, is Zeus complaining to the other gods, look at how these mortals suffer. They bring suffering upon themselves, but then blame us as if we, did something when they compound their own misery beyond its allotted share, or something to that effect. So, she's adding meaning here that is not in the Greek, while at the same time criticizing other translators for doing the same thing. And I think there's a difference in intention there, and which is revealed in the way that she goes after other translators. Let me see if I can jump to the other part here, the Telemachus part.
So now I'm going to turn to a fairly harrowing passage much later on in the poem. And I apologize for spoilers for people who haven't read the Odyssey. Odysseus does in fact get home to Ithaca. He leaves Calypso, goes through a whole bunch of shipwrecks and adventures. All the men are drowned or eaten. Gets back, disguised as an old beggar with the help of Athena, whose plot the whole poem is. And he finally manages, with the help of the goddess and his son and a couple of useful slaves, to kill all the suitors. Then Odysseus instructs Telemachus, his son, and the others to take the slave women who slept with the suitors, whom Odysseus said earlier in the same book were raped by the suitors, outside and hack all the life out of them with long swords. Telemachus, who up to this point has been a pretty dopey kid, whose only real initiative is shown when he shuts up his mother, which he does twice. Then at this moment, for the first time, he has an idea of his own. He contradicts his big shot father and insists that they must instead be murdered by hanging, because they're too metaphorically dirty for him to touch with his sword. So clearly there's a lot of creepy psychosexual stuff going on in this disturbing passage. There's also to do with the way that Telemachus is defined in terms of, can he grow up to being a man? Will he ever be ready to get married? Those questions are there in the poem and there in this passage. And his issues about women, women's voices, and of course hanging is the easiest way to make sure you don't hear a woman's voice ever again. So this is the Greek, which I'm guessing that many people don't read, but I just wanted to flag the fact that there is no term of abuse in what Telemachus says about the women. He describes them as the women who slept beside the suitors. So I wanted to just go through several different translation choices and flag how the culmination of different translation choices can make a huge difference to what kind of perspective do we have on this disturbing scene. And it's specifically to the what I think is a central question about this passage, but then in general about the Odyssey, through whose eyes do we see? Do we only see through the eyes of Odysseus and Telemachus? Or do we get to see the eyes of the victims of those characters as well? Do we see more than one perspective? So Telemachus is described, as he usually is, as pepnumenos, which suggests that he's taken some kind of thought. Has he taken a good kind of thought? It's open to interpretation whether you decide to translate that very conventional word as something which suggests this murderer at this moment is thinking really, really smart kinds of things. If you use words like thoughtful, you suggest, great job, he's very thoughtful, this must be a reasonable thing to do. If you say sagacious, again, I think it suggests this is a reasonable action.
All right, I jumped to the wrong spot again, but I hope you can hear in the way she's describing this the intense, the like barely contained contempt and hatred for all the men in this story, for Odysseus and Telemachus, the intense moral judgment that belies the kind of objectivity that she's hiding behind. Oh, Homer has this very objective perspective that doesn't only show the perspective of the murderer, but also of the victims. Okay, like framing, we're talking about translations, we're talking about word choice. Murderer and victim is not an objective frame, right? That is an inherently judging frame. So we can hold to the judgmental frame if we like. Perhaps these serving girls are morally blameworthy for sleeping with and offering, aid and pleasure to the men who have taken over their, their master's house, unlike Eumaeus and the plenty of other servant girls who did not do such a thing. Why did only some do this and others did not? So, there is a kind of duplicitousness in the way she is presenting this this perspectivism here. But let me jump ahead and see if I can find my least favorite part.
So I didn't put in extra abusive language which isn't there in the Greek, which is partly because I don't read it in the same way that these translators obviously do.
I mean, that's only if you assume he failed is not abuse, because you put that in. That's not in the Greek, but I won't interrupt it again.
I don't think that what Telemachus is saying is these women deserve punishment. I think what he's saying is these women are a source of shame to me, and therefore I want them dead, which is a different thing from this. Telemachus then took initiative, insisting, "I refuse to grant these girls a clean death, since they poured down shame on me and mother when they lay beside the suitors." At that he wound a piece of sailor's rope round the rotunda and round the mighty pillar, stretched up so high no foot could touch the ground, as doves or thrushes spread their wings to fly home to their nests. But someone set a trap. They crashed into a net, a bit of bedtime. Just so the girls, their heads all in a row, were strung up with the noose around their necks to make their death an agony. They gasped, feet twitching for a while, but not for long.
So that voice, there are a bunch of parts in there I wish I could capture, but I ended up capturing, I think, a lot of what I wanted to convey here, which is just in hearing her put Telemachus in that voice and persistently characterizing him as this this petulant young boy. Oh, his big manly moments were the times he rebuked his mother. Like, she hates Odysseus and she hates Telemachus and the male characters in general in the book. And so the problem with Wilson as a translation, to answer the question more directly, is that she is she's an ideological translator. She is not she's not morally qualified to be a translator of Homer. Another section of Greg Naj's Ancient Greek Hero describes the idea of an ainos, which is an intentionally cryptic tale told by elders, usually towards younger men, that is designed to be cryptic intentionally so as not to cause the young men to kind of dig in their heels and instinctively do the opposite. It's designed to permit the young men agency and to make their own choices. And but in order to understand an ainos, Greg Naj says one must be morally qualified. You must be a good person. You must be intellectually qualified. And you also must be near and dear, philoi. Emily Wilson is clearly intellectually qualified. She's very smart. She's a very good writer. But she's not near and dear to Homer. She's not philoi because she has her own ideological loyalties that prevent her from doing that. And she's not agathoi, morally qualified either, for the same reason. An ideological translator cannot get in the correct frame of mind of a poet to convey the proper feeling. And in this case, she's actually very skillfully doing the opposite. And she does this persistently. There was a blogger, I was kind of trolling around reading other posts, who compiled a list of contrasts between the Fagel's translation of the Odyssey and the Wilson translation of the Odyssey. And this blogger wrote, "Sing versus tell, the man versus a man. Twists and turns versus complicated. Driven time and again off course versus he wandered and was lost. Plundered versus wrecked. Many pains versus the pain. Fighting to save his life versus he worked to save his life. The differences become clear when the text is apotheosized into English, embellished, cleaned up. It's possible that Odysseus is made to be better than he really is. Like when Athena takes a shabby Greek and brightens his complexion, enlarges his muscles, heightens his stature, or tosses his hair with curls. But all for what? We should appreciate Odysseus for who he is without embellishments. End quote. Now, I think that very accurately summarizes the spirit of Wilson's translation, but not the intent. I don't think she is trying to appreciate Odysseus. I think at every turn, at every opportunity, she uses the subjective power of translation to attempt to bring Odysseus down to earth, to tear him down, to make him more mundane, more immoral, more blameworthy, more bumbling. And she does this with Telemachus too. And to detract from the glory of his homecoming story. Because the Nostos is not just the homecoming, but as Greg Nosh points out, it's also the song about the homecoming. It's a kind of glory, not identical with Kleos, but similar. So I think the problem with Wilson is that she's an ideological translator. Now, what makes her compelling is that she is a very good writer. Her translation is very readable. It has this very simple, clear, blunt directness that almost feels Homeric in a way. But how do I put this? There's a famous Einstein quote where he says, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? I think that's what, if we were to make not just an ideological critique and a psychological critique, but also a stylistic critique, she's done the opposite of what Alexander Pope did. Alexander Pope flourished it up and made it so grandiose and flowery that it actually hid the brutal directness of Homer behind this kind of euphemistic floweriness. Wilson, I think, has done the opposite. She has made it so blunt and direct that it's taken the elevation out of Homer. Because Homer is not only blunt and direct, it is also elevated. The language was archaic even at the time of its writing, in the 9th or 8th century BC. It was much like the King James Bible was in the 15th or 16th century when that was written. It was including archaic language bits like thine and thou that had already fallen out of fashion, but it included them to give it this kind of elevated air. Homer is elevated. Homer is aristocratic. It's not like normal language. And her bluntness, which she does both intentionally to, to change the feeling and the quality of Odysseus and how we experience him, we actually lose semantic meaning there too. And the classic example of this with her, I'll just go over the basic one. There are others, but is her choice of palutropon, which, as was pointed out, Fegel's translated as of twists and turns. Greg Nosh says that palutropon can be translated either as much turning or very wily or very cunning. And in the case of Odysseus, it might be both of those things together, and the ambiguity is kind of intentional. The like layers of kenning working with each other weave a more complex picture just in the word itself. It's kind of a beautiful thing. All of that sense of complexity in this much turning, wily, always twisting and managing to escape and getting into interesting position is just complicated for Emily Wilson. I mean, is it technically true? Sure, in the sense that you could say the Grand Canyon is large. some of the grandiosity that you'd expect from something with a name like grand is lost when you just say it's large. It's not vast. It's not expansive. It's not, beyond the horizon. It's not awe-inspiring or daunting. No, it's large. That's the sense of what's being done to polutropon when you translate polutropon as complicated. And it's not just diminishing. It's actually it's not just simplifying. It's simplistic. You're losing semantic meaning there. So, anyways, that's the critique of Emily Wilson and why I think there are better options out there. It is good writing. I can see why people like her. I can see why people would be drawn in and be like, man, I'm connecting with this so well, because she has that direct, clear style that is in stark contrast with someone like Alexander Pope. But I think you could see the Catholics have this saying, I'm fond of bringing it up, that heresies come in pairs. There's the initial heresy on the one hand, and then there's the overreaction to the heresy on the other. There's someone who says, oh, Jesus isn't even divine, and then someone says, nonsense, Jesus is not only divine, he's wholly divine, and the church is like, no, you're both wrong. I think we have you could create a similar kind of dichotomy between Alexander Pope on one hand, who is not just he's not just elevating the language, he's trying to basically save Homer from his own directness, because the European audiences wanted flowery, euphemistic poetry that rhymed and all this stuff. And so he's trying to elevate Homer beyond what he actually is. And what you end up with is not Homer. And then on the other hand, you have Emily Wilson, who is not just not trying to elevate him, but actively trying to tear him down, or at least the heroes of the story. And what you end up with is a style that is blunt and direct. I love bringing up this example too. I referenced Charge of the Light Brigade, the poem, earlier, as this poem that kind of glories in war. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward into the valley of death rode the 600. And it's this story about the noble sacrifice. Theirs is not to do or die. Theirs is not to question why. Theirs is but to do or die. It's this very kind of nationalistic, patriotic poem written in Homeric meter. And then on the other hand, you have from approximately the same time period another poem called Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which I would encourage people to read. It doesn't rhyme. It's direct, brutally honest about the experience of a soldier on the Western Front in World War I, going through a gas attack, chlorine gas, and watching someone die because they didn't get their gas mask on fast enough. And he said if you could see him, his tongue hanging out, his lungs, wheezing, dying, drowning. You could see in his eyes him drowning on this cart. You would not say with such zest, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which means, just and fitting it is to die for one's country, or something to that effect. And it's that brutal, not rhyming, direct, clear awfulness of war. And the question someone might ask is, which is it? Which one is war really like? And you'll hear people make arguments in both cases. But I think the true Homeric answer is not one or the other. It's both. I think anyone who's read the Iliad can't help but read these passages of someone gets just a spear through their cheek and they're screaming, and then Homer goes on this weird tangential aside about how they were a silversmith and they had just gotten married before they went to go fight at Troy, and now they'll never see their wife again. It's he does that over and over again. That's horror, And then you see the Aristeia of Diomedes, or Patroclus saving the Greek line, or of Achilles fighting the river. And it's there's glory there too. It's both. And I think these people who try to either elevate Homer out of a belief of some deficiency, perhaps, in that brutal directness, or people who try to tear him down for the opposite reason, the Emily Wilsons of the world, they miss the duality of war, man. That they miss the duality of life that Homer captures. He is bigger than their ideologies or their aesthetic tastes. And I think, well, I'll conclude on this, I suppose. Emily Wilson is not worth reading because she doesn't attempt to capture that duality. Not even incidentally, she's in fact opposing it. So, anyways, that's my opinion on Emily Wilson. Why I don't like her, don't recommend her. I believe actually Jack was made aware of Emily Wilson because of some stuff I had written about her. So not only do I agree with him, I think he actually agrees with me. But we agree with each other on this front. And if you are a feminist who are listening to this and you want a good translation of Homer by a woman, Caroline Alexander is top class. Caroline Alexander is excellent. She's actually one of the ones who puts rage as the first word in the Iliad. So, top-notch points for her. Anyways, thank you all for listening. Sorry this had to be done live. I ran into technical issues, as I mentioned at the beginning of the stream. So, I had to do it off the cuff. But I hope this was educational and edifying. And if you have any of your own questions, first of all, if you like content like this, feel free to hit like and subscribe and all that good stuff. But if you have your own philosophical question about philosophy or religion, the classics, stuff of that nature, feel free to head over to caffeineandphilosophy.com/office hours and can answer more questions. So